It's my honor to introduce my teacher, Professor Judith Hauptman. The title of her presentation is Some Very Short Stories About Women in the Talmud. Professor Hauptman is the E. Billy Ivory Professor Emerit of Talmud and Rabbinic Culture at the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York. Her research focuses on two main areas: tracing the history of the text of the Talmud and teasing women's history out of rabbinic texts. She's the author of 3 books and numerous articles. Her volume, Rereading the Rabbis, A Woman's Voice, has been called a founding work of the new Jewish feminism. She's a fellow of the prestigious American Academy for Jewish Research. In 2004, she established Oil Ayala, a free walk-in high holiday service for Jews in their 20s and 30s. Hundreds attend each year. So without further ado, Professor Judith Hauptman. Professor Rabbi Judith Hauptman.
Okay, shalom. It's very nice to sit in New York City and know that there are people in Brazil who are tuning into this Zoom session. So I've chosen 4 very short stories to bring to your attention. I'm going to screen share so you can see them. Let me just give you a little bit of introduction. The Talmud, which was written 1500 to 2000 years ago, is kind of the Bible of Jewish practice. It laid out the basic rules of Jewish practice. So a lot of the Talmud is discussion of law, but some of the Talmud, a small portion of the Talmud, are stories or anecdotes about how individual rabbis or individual women, wives of rabbis, sisters, daughters of rabbis, how they carried out the law. I got very interested in looking at these small anecdotes, these small stories about women that appear in the Talmud. And this is a book that I'm writing right now, and my general thesis, I'll try to convince you of it today with examples. My general thesis is that a rabbi, an earlier rabbi, sets out, puts down a law, states a halakha. Halakha is a rule of Jewish practice. He states a halakha, and then 30, 40, 100 years later, another rabbi comes along, and the Talmud tells us, oh, this second rabbi who lived later, he performed the halakha of the earlier rabbi. But if you read the story closely, you discover that the reason that little story is there in the Talmud is actually to tell you that the rabbi who lived later, when he carried out the law, made a small change in the law. And my general message is the Talmud itself is telling us that it's okay when you carry out a law. Let me just backtrack for a moment. Rabbis figure out laws when they're sitting around a table and discussing things with each other, and they reach a conclusion, and then they publicize the conclusion they reached. But that's all very theoretical. 100 years later, when some other rabbi performs the halakha, he discovers that it doesn't quite work in his day and in his place, so he introduces a little change. And I think that is a message of the Talmud, that laws can be changed if, as time passes, they don't continue to work the way they were supposed to. That's all very general. And now let's look at some stories about women. I have written about women in the Talmud. I think people are interested in knowing always, well, were women in the Talmud second-class citizens? Well, my answer, unfortunately, is yes. But I will also say, and I have a book about this, they were second-class citizens, but the rabbis consistently were improving women's legal status. That's not what we're going to look at today. I just want you to know that's my attitude about the law and women in the Talmud. But I chose these 4 anecdotes to illustrate that general idea about changing halakha, and because it's interesting to see what the Talmud has to say about women. So I'm now going to screen share. I've got to click on a few things here so that...
First, you have to share your screen with us.
Yes, I have to, but I want to click on share screen.
Yes.
It's not letting me. It says host disabled, participant screen sharing. What am I supposed to do?
So
I'm going to make you co-host. Just a minute, sorry.
Okay. All right. Let me give you some background about the first anecdote while this is happening. There is a rule about Jewish marriage, a Mishnah that's part of the Talmud. The Mishnah states that when a woman marries, she owes her husband 7 domestic duties, such as baking the bread and cooking the food and doing the laundry and making the bed and so on. There's a list of 7, and this story in the beginning, okay, now I can share screen, is going to focus on, I will tell you, okay, there I go, Limud Brazil, okay. You should be able to see it nicely on screen. So after that Mishnah, that earlier Jewish text teaching lists these 7 tasks, it then says if a woman brings maidservants with her, people who work for her, into the marriage, then she can ask them to perform those activities like baking and laundry and so on. And if it says 1, 2, 3 maidservants, but if she brings in 4 maidservants, she doesn't have to do anything at all. I'm reading on the screen now. If she brought in 4 maidservants, okay, I'm having trouble moving this screen. Okay, there we go. I'm going to go back to the beginning. Okay, just 1 second. Moving it back up. I don't know how to do this any faster, but here we go. Okay, if she brought 4, I'm reading the English. If she brought 4 maidservants into the marriage, she may sit in an easy chair. In Hebrew, Yoshevet b'katedra. All right, very nice. No baking and no laundry and so on. Then along comes this rabbi, Amar Rav Yitzchak bar Chananya Amar Rav Huna, one rabbi in the name of another rabbi. Even though they said that a woman with 4 maidservants may sit in an easy chair, they're not letting her off without any obligations. She still must pour him his cup of wine, make his bed for him. That's not quite the same thing as those 7 domestic tasks. It's like turning down the blanket, plumping up the pillows. Must make his bed, wash his face, hands, and feet for him. All right, so a woman with lots of help in the house doesn't have to do any of the demanding labors that a woman without servants would have to do. But on an intimate level, the commentators on the Talmud say, the rabbis require her to pour his cup of wine, make his bed, wash his face, hands, and feet, because that will get him to feel affection for her. All right, I will not call that unreasonable. I think that is quite reasonable. But the other thing I want to point out is these are activities that she performs for him when they get into bed at night. In America, we call it a nightcap. Having an alcoholic drink at night, we call a nightcap. So she's going to bring him a cup of wine right before they go to sleep, make the bed comfortable, and then before he gets in, wash his face, hands, and feet. All right, that's what this rabbi said. And, it's his point of view. He didn't, there are no women there. I guess I should say that right now. Men make the laws. Women are expected to fulfill the laws, but occasionally their voices are heard. You'll see in a moment. This same rabbi said something else. I'm continuing in the English. Said Rav Yitzchak bar Chananya, said Rav Huna, all the tasks that a woman performs for her husband, a menstruant performs for her husband. That's nida, a woman in her period of blood flow, shall we say 7 days a month. All the tasks that a woman performs for her husband that we talked about above there, as that she has to make his bed, pour him his cup of wine, even when she is experiencing the flow of blood, she must still perform these tasks for her husband. I'm sorry, let me backtrack. I said something wrong. This rabbi is saying all those tasks like baking the bread and doing the laundry and cooking and taking care of the children, those tasks that a woman performs for her husband, a menstruant can still perform those 7 tasks for her husband or have the maidservants perform them. But here is the exception. When she is a menstruant, she may not, except for, she may not pour his cup. She may not make his bed. She may not wash his face, hands, and feet. These are exceptions to the rule when she is a menstruant, in Hebrew, nida, for the obvious reason that these are erotic activities that lead towards sexual activity. So fine, there are times during the month when she may not bring him his wine at night, lest it lead to other kinds of activity. Now the rabbis are going to focus just on that phrase, umizigat hakos. She may not, by the way, literally this means to dilute the wine because they had strong wine and they would dilute it with water, 3 parts water to 1 part wine, or 2 parts water to 1 part wine, something along those lines. But now come these little anecdotes. Everything up until now that I have read are what we call prescriptive law, telling you how to behave, giving you rules for your Jewish observance. But now come these little anecdotes about how these rules were actually carried out. Okay, and pouring his cup, we're going to talk now just about the woman who may not pour her husband his cup of wine when she is a menstruant. And 4 little anecdotes. I'll read all 4 at once and then comment on them. Samuel's wife switched it, that's the cup of wine, to her left hand. Okay, I'm going to comment on this right now. Generally speaking, you serve wine, you bring the cup of wine. Okay, I have a little clock in my hand, but it means you carry the wine, you bring it to the person you are serving wine in your right hand, because the left hand is actually for toilet activities. But this wife, Samuel's wife, understood that she's not allowed to serve her husband wine. So she said to herself, I think he needs his wine even tonight when I'm in nida, when I'm menstruant. So how can I bring it to him? If I bring it in my right hand, I'm serving it to him, and that's not allowed. So she switched it to her left hand. She brought him his wine that night, every night when she's in nida, with her left hand. Abaye's wife set it on the mouth of the cask. This is a few generations later. Abaye, all these rabbis happen to be well-known, prominent Talmudic rabbis. His wife also knew that she couldn't serve him his wine the way he was used to. So she set it down right near him on the mouth of the cask. That's the container of wine. Rava's wife put it on the pillow. She knows she can't bring it to him and serve it to him because Rav Huna said not allowed to do that when you're nida. So she just puts it on the pillow and he picks it up. And Rav Papa's wife put it on the stool near the bed. So there too, she puts it down and he picks it up. So what we see here, now I'm going to say something in a moment. Let me just stop and say, I don't know how men who study Talmud in a yeshiva understand these 4 little anecdotes, but I'm going to tell you now how I understand these 4 little anecdotes. These 4 wives are saying to themselves, he needs his drink every night. Yes, I want my husband to feel affection for me. I can't just bring him his wine 3 weeks out of a month. I want to bring him his wine 4 weeks out of the month. And I surely don't want a maidservant bringing his wine to him at night, because that could lead to something that I don't want to see. So I'm going to bring him his wine, but I'm going to change the halacha a little bit. The rule is I can't serve it to him. Okay, well, if I bring it to him, not with my right hand, or if I bring it to him, but I don't put it in his hand, I just put it down near him, then I'm getting him his wine and I'm not violating Jewish law, because the law says don't serve it to him. Well, serving means either bringing it with your right hand and putting it in his hand. So I'll either bring it with my left hand and put it in his hand, or I won't put it in his hand at all. I'll put it down near him. So these four women, I happen to love this particular passage of the Talmud. These four women sensed a problem with the law that Rav Huna put out there, that the law that he stated. They felt, they're very selfless women because they were benefiting their husbands. In other words, they made these changes not exactly to benefit themselves, because it has nothing to do with their drinking wine, it has to do with him drinking wine. So these women figured out a solution how to fulfill the requirement not to serve wine when she is a nida, but at the same time that he should still get his wine. So this is a little change in Jewish law that these women themselves brought about. I wish I could tell you that the next three examples are also going to be women introducing changes into Jewish law. I cannot say that. We're going to see more about women in just a moment. But this is a remarkable series of tiny anecdotes. If you read the Hebrew, I've bolded it. You can see that there are four anecdotes. The last anecdote is one word, or if you like, Rav Papa, Rav Arsha Shifa, it's 3 words. Before that, 3 words. Before that, 5 words. And before that, 6 words. These are tiny anecdotes. But the message of these little anecdotes, and by the way, this ends the discussion. Nobody comes along and says, oh, she really can't do that. She doesn't understand. Nothing. These 4 women get the last word. The halakha, Jewish law, is determined, is fixed according to what these 4 women did. So they took Rav Huna's rule and they modified it a little bit. All right, going on to the next anecdote. Raking out an oven on a festival. That means to rake out an oven is to clear out what accumulates on the bottom of an oven. Now, these are not ovens that we have in our kitchens today. If you want to imagine an oven back in those times, it looked a little bit like an igloo, like kind of a dome with an opening, and you could put your dough on a flat piece of wood, we call it a peel, and you slip your dough, like a pizza dough, into the oven, and you slap it up against the wall, the inside wall of this dome-like oven. However, ashes accumulate on the floor of this dome-like oven, and what the earlier code of Jewish law says is, I'm going to skip the beginning of it, I'm just going to say, nor rake out. One may not rake out an oven or a stove on a Jewish festival, Pesach, Shavuot, Sukkot. You may not do this. You want to get the ashes out of your oven? Then you do it the day before. You don't have to do that on the holiday. Yes, you can bake bread, you can cook food, you can roast meat, you can do all kinds of food preparation on the holiday, but that's where they draw the line. You want to get your oven ready for cooking on the holiday. Obviously, they didn't have refrigeration, so the food that they're going to eat on the holiday, they have to cook on the holiday. They also want tasty food, as we will see. So rake it out in advance. But the Mishnah continues and says, teaching here at the top, but one may press down the ashes. Okay, you can't clear out the ashes on the festival itself, but if there's an accumulation of ashes, you can just push it down, and in that way, your bread will bake better. By the way, the whole goal of raking out an oven is to allow the air to circulate better, to the bread shouldn't burn, and so on. All right, that's the earlier strand of Jewish law called Mishnah. Now we go to the Gemara, the commentary on those older rules, nor rake out an oven or a stove. And instead of my continuing reading immediately Rav Chia Bar Yosef in the Hebrew and in the English, that rabbi lives later than the rabbi who appears in the following paragraph. So I will go back afterwards to Rav Chia Bar Yosef. I'm going to the anecdote right now. Now, in Hebrew and Aramaic, actually, the opening word is debitu. Let me see, I can put my cursor on it. I hope you see that. Debitu, if you know Hebrew, you see the word bayit in there. It means house. Debitu means of his house. The person who is of his house is his wife. And in English, we call it a housewife. That's all that's being said here. Debitu de Rabbi Chia. So the wife of Rabbi Chia, what happened? Nafala aricha betanura b'yom hatava. it's Yom Tov, it's Yontef, it's a festival, some Jewish festival, in which we don't do work, but as I said, we do cook. And what happened, unexpectedly, a brick fell down. In other words, the oven is probably made of some kind of brick or sun-baked clay, and a piece of it falls down into her oven on Yom Tov. Now, in order to bake good bread, you've got to get rid of that brick because that brick might heat up and burn the bread. But she knows that raking out the oven is not allowed. Well, how do I know that she knows? Because the next line says, Amarla Rabbi Chia, her husband said to her, meaning she approached him, told him there's a brick in the oven, honey. And he says to her, Chazi, look, Da'ana rifta ma'alyata ba'ina. Look, I want excellent bread. Okay? So she basically came to him with a question of, do I rake out the oven today? The unexpected has occurred. I know I'm not supposed to, but yesterday there was no brick there. Today, I want to bake bread for you, dear husband, and I've got a brick in the oven. What shall I do? That seems to be the implied question here. And he, instead of saying to her, if I were asking the question, I want the answer, either yes, rake it out, or no, don't rake it out. But he says to her, look, I want excellent bread. So I've already written in the English. He's basically telling her kind of in language, which I would call coded or CODE or veiled language. I'm not going to openly tell you to rake out the oven because the Mishnah says no raking out the oven. But the Mishnah, according to this rabbi, was talking about situations where you could rake it out in advance. But here we are on Yom Tov. We've got a brick in the oven. What are we going to do? And he says, I want tasty bread. So you understand what he's saying to her in his own way of saying it is go rake out that oven today on Yom Tov. So the woman, the wife in this particular anecdote, she is not the one who made the change in Jewish law. Her husband is the one who made the change. He's basically saying, sure, we don't rake out ovens on Yom Tov because we rake them out the day before. But if an unforeseen circumstance leads to burning the bread that I want to eat on Yom Tov, and good food and good meals are part of the celebration of the festival, okay, you're going to go and rake out the oven. So he made a small change in Jewish law. Now I'm going to go back to the part that I skipped. I'll read it in the Hebrew. Tani Rav Chia bar Yosef Kamei de Rav Nachman. This rabbi, okay, there are two Rabbi Chias on screen right now. The Rabbi Chia with a wife lived earlier. He's actually in the generation that's kind of transitioning from the earlier Mishnah to the commentary Gemara, commentary on the Mishnah. And now we have a second Rav Chia. The first one is called Rabbi Chia. This one is called Rav Chia, but his full name is Rav Chia bar Yosef. So it's a different rabbi who lived later than the first Rabbi Chia. And this second Rav Chia taught in the presence of his teacher, Rav Nachman, very prominent rabbi in the Talmud. But if one cannot bake unless he first rakes it out, it is permitted to do so. What I'm trying to say is that the second Rabbi Chia put into law the rule of the first Rabbi Chia. The Mishnah says no raking out. The first Rabbi Chia says, sure, no raking out, but for an unforeseen circumstance, there is raking out on a festival. And then the second Rabbi Chia, taking it not as an anecdote anymore, he states it as a rule, okay? If you are not able to, if it's not possible to bake good bread, obviously, without raking out, then raking out is permitted. So here too, my general point is the rule said no raking out, and along comes a rabbi, namely the first Rabbi Chia, and says, well, there are times, there's an exception to the rule, and if you have to rake out to have good bread, in other words, if you don't rake out, you'll have bread that's not so good. If you do rake out, you'll have great bread. With those two choices, we rake out, we clear out the ashes from the oven on a Jewish holiday. All right, third anecdote. This one is somewhat more complicated. It's called Women Hulling barley. To hull barley is to remove the outer layer that's not edible. You've got to peel the bran off the kernels of barley in order to be able to eat. You can actually feed those outer coatings to animals. So a Mishnah elsewhere says, "Hamakalef seorim mikalef achat achat ve'ochel." This Mishnah, we are now in a tractate called Shabbat, but the Mishnah that's being quoted here is not from Shabbat, which would be about the Sabbath. It's about giving a tithe, giving 10% of various parts of your produce to the Levite or to the Kohen. So the Mishnah says that if you're peeling barley on a holiday, I'm sorry, I didn't mean on a holiday. We're not talking holidays anymore. If you are peeling barley, you should peel one kernel at a time. If this is what you're doing, popping it into your mouth, a little bit like popcorn, you just keep feeding it into your mouth because it's delicious. If you are peeling barley and popping it into the mouth, then you are exempt from tithing that amount of barley because this is not a meal. However, if you are hulling barley, peeling barley, and you're filling your hand with your hulled kernels, your peeled kernels, then you've got to give 10% of that to the Levite or to the Kohen. Okay, that's a simple rule, I think. Along comes a rabbi and says, Rabbi Elazar, been reading in Hebrew, v'chein l'Shabbat, meaning the same rule applies to the Sabbath, meaning we're going to distinguish between snacking on barley and, collecting a lot of barley all at once. So the same rule applies to the Sabbath. That is, one may hull one kernel at a time and eat it. And if you do that on the Sabbath, you are not violating the Sabbath. Just popping one into the mouth at a time, that removal of the outer layer of the kernel of barley does not constitute a labor on the Sabbath. That would be forbidden. But hulling into one's hand is a forbidden Sabbath labor. But if you're collecting a lot of kernels that you're peeling into your hand, then you're overdoing it. Okay, then it's like threshing on the Sabbath, which is one of the 39 forbidden Sabbath labors. All right, that's the law. The law is pretty clear. There's a law about tithing, which we're not going to look at anymore, and there's a law about the Sabbath. And now comes the anecdote. Stam, the anonymous voice, asks, is that so? Is it really so that you're not allowed to hull a whole handful of barley kernels, peel a whole handful of barley kernels on the Sabbath? But did not Rav's wife hull for him cupfuls of barley on the Sabbath? And didn't Rabbi Chia's wife hull for him cupfuls on the Sabbath? And, okay, this is a problem. The anecdote all by itself simply says, this woman who was married to a rabbi and that woman was married to Rabbi Chia, the same woman we had in the previous anecdote, didn't these two wives of rabbis go ahead and on the Sabbath hull cupfuls or handfuls of barley, a cupful, I'm equating it with a handful, okay, a lot, not just a little, more than a snack. Didn't these women do it? Which means that they were violating the Sabbath according to Rabbi Elazar. In other words, the opening statement said something about tithing. Along comes Rabbi Elazar and says, and on the Sabbath, all you can do is one kernel at a time, kind of popping it in the mouth. But if you peel more barley than that on the Sabbath, you are violating the Sabbath. And then the Gemara says, oh, but we have these two women who did exactly that. Weren't they violating the Sabbath? How could it be? How could it be that Rabbi Elazar says, don't do this, and you get these two women who are doing it? And the answer is, there we are at the top over here. The answer is, the Gemara answers, an anonymous voice answers, Rabbi Elazar's statement was made in conjunction, I say I left out the N, in conjunction with the second clause of the Mishnah, which states, if one rubs ears of wheat, he may winnow a little at a time and eat without tithing. But I'll explain all this. But if he winnows into his lap, he is liable to tithe. Okay. The problem we are experiencing right now is that the women seem to be in violation of Rabbi Elazar's rule of he doesn't allow hulling a lot of barley on the Sabbath. And the anecdote tells us that they did do that. By the way, for their husbands. It says they did it they did it for him, hull for him. So these women are doing their best to feed their husbands on the Sabbath. And now it looks as if they're violating the Sabbath according to the rule of Rabbi Elazar. So something amazing happens. Along comes some voice, I don't know who, there's no name here, and says, you know that statement of Rabbi Elazar that the tithing rule applies to the Sabbath, applies to barley hulling on the Sabbath? No, you got it wrong. His statement does not apply to hulling barley on the Sabbath. It applies to wheat, winnowing wheat. It's the same idea, pulling the bran off the wheat and so on. You made a mistake in thinking that Rabbi Elazar was saying you can't hull a cupful of barley on the Sabbath. No, he was saying you can't hull a cupful of wheat, which means that these women have been redeemed. That once we say that Rabbi Elazar is not talking about barley, but he's talking about wheat, then what the women were doing is perfectly fine. And again, we see here that a change is made in halakha, that is to say, along comes Rabbi Elazar and wants to add a stringency to the Sabbath, tell you something that you can't do that until his time you could do. And when he first tried to do that, it looked as if he was making those women into Sabbath violators, Machalelei Shabbat. But the anonymous voice of the Talmud decides, we're going to leave those women alone. They were doing what they were doing, and we're going to let them keep doing it, and they're doing it on barley. As far as this rabbi as trying to make Jewish law strict, go ahead, Rabbi Elazar, put your stringency on the wheat. We're not going to let you put it on the barley, because if you do, you're going to take away what those women were doing. So here we have Rabbi Elazar adding a stringency to Jewish law, but within the Jewish law, his stringency is limited to wheat and not to barley, and the women win out. Okay, I'm not saying the women actively promoted their cause. There's no reason to think that. This anonymous voice of the Talmud, I think, wanted to, this is the wife of Rav and the wife of Rabbi Chia, he wanted to keep those women looking good, not violating Jewish law. Okay, and now we get to, I think this is the last, yes, so I think I have 5 minutes approximately to do this last one. It should be, we're not discussing barley or wheat or hulling. The topic here, the broader topic of this discussion of this passage is robbery. Jewish law is very strict. Of course, you can't go to somebody and just relieve them of, just take their wallet from them and keep it. No, of course you cannot do that. But Jewish law is worried about activities that in some way could be understood as taking away from somebody that which belongs to him without his permission. And if you do that, you're robbing. So the topic here is, it begins with a quote, one may purchase from women. Well, we'll see what that means. A braita is simply a teaching of the rabbis. One may purchase woolen garments in Judea from women. Lokchim min hanashim. You may purchase these kinds of garments from Judea because women made those garments themselves, but not wine or oil or fine flour, because if you buy those products, which are farm products, from women in Judea, you might be stealing from their husbands, because these women, if they're selling you from the doorway of their home some wine, some oil, or some fine flour, it could be that that's the products their husband produces, and without his permission, they are selling. Abba Shaul says a woman may sell 4 or 5 denarii, enough to make herself a kippah. This is interesting because today men wear a kippah. Back then, women wore a kippah. It's a skull cap, hugs the skull, and then women could stick a feather or a ribbon or whatever in it. And now we come to the law that the anecdote will address. Charity collectors may accept small donations from women, but not large ones. Okay, I'm going to skip the rest of the teaching and go right down to the anecdote. Okay, I'm beginning here. Ravina, I'm going to read it in English. Ravina visited the town of Beit Machoza. Ravina is a rabbi in the Talmud who appears quite often. He's well known. And he visits this town. And it seems that he's coming to this town, he's visiting it for the purpose of collecting charity. I don't know which charity he's collecting for, but it is clear from the anecdote that that's the purpose of his visit. And now what happens? The women of Beit Machoza came and threw chains and bracelets before him. In other words, you have to imagine what we call here in the United States, a parlor meeting. Somebody says, I'll gather my friends in my apartment and generally speaking, my rich friends, and you can come and tell all of us about your charity, and maybe they'll write a check. That's a parlor meeting. It seems that the women of Beit Machoza were in somebody's home. In comes Ravina, talks about whatever charity he's collecting money for, and he is so effective that they take off their chains, their necklaces, their bracelets, and they throw it at him. Okay. And he obviously had a talent for doing this. He accepted these expensive items from them. Okay, if you're collecting from a charity and somebody gives you a check for $1,000, you don't tear it up. You say, oh, yes, thank you. Very nice of you. I appreciate it. But this rabbi is in trouble. Said to him, Rabbi Tosfa, this is a younger rabbi is going to challenge. This is like teacher-student relationship. The younger rabbi says to the senior rabbi is Ravina, the younger rabbi is Rabbi Tosfa. Senior rabbi says, have we not learned in a rabbinic rule, a braita, that charity collectors may accept a small donation from a woman, but not a large one? Meaning, Ravina, these women are throwing at you silver bracelets, gold chains, and you accept them. Those are large donations. You know the teaching just the way I know the teaching. You may not accept a large donation from a woman, again, because there's a fear that she's giving away her husband's money. I understand in this case it's her jewelry, but still, he gave it to her. But he accepted the jewelry, and his student reminds him, this is a criticism, but done very gently. Don't you know the teaching that you cannot accept from a woman such a large donation? And here's the last line. Ravina responded, for the people of Machoza, this is, I'll give you an analogy in a moment. These are small donations. Okay, this is a clever, clever answer. Ravina accepted these donations from the women. He surely does not want to have to give them back. And he justifies his action by saying the following. Sure, that rabbinic teaching was, you cannot accept a large donation from women. And now Ravina says, you know what that meant? No large donation from a woman. That means I can accept a gold chain from a woman in Machoza because the people of Machoza are known throughout the Talmud, this is true, as being rich. So for a woman in Machoza to give me a gold chain, for her, that's a small donation. Okay, what's a gold chain? $500? I don't know. That's okay. If she were to give him, what he's saying is, if she were to give me a check for $100,000, no, I can't accept that. That would be a big donation. Meaning, he's saying to a student, the words in the teaching, no, do not accept large donations from women, only small donations. The words large and small are to be understood as relative terms, not like, oh, $100 is small and $250 is large. No, that's not the way it works. You have to judge each donor according to that donor's circumstances. Now, I can just say, living in Manhattan, that an Upper East Side woman who gives $1,000 that's a small donation, because if a woman in the Bronx gave $1,000, that would be a large donation. So yes, you can accept $1,000 from a woman whom you happen to know is rich. You cannot accept $1,000, says Ravina, from a woman you happen to know is poor, because then she's giving away her husband's money. All right, so what did Ravina do here? He changed Jewish law. The Jewish law says do not take a large donation from a woman. And he said, no, that doesn't mean what you think it means. I can accept a large donation from a woman if she is rich, but not if she is poor. So I rest my case. I've shown you 4 examples of tiny anecdotes in the Talmud. I chose them because they all feature a woman, in which the anecdote, whoever is acting in the anecdote, be it a rabbi or be it a rabbi's wife, introduces a small change into Jewish law. That is the message of these anecdotes in the Talmud. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Hauptman. That was such a delight to hear you. And we have a few questions from our audience. I'm going to start with Rabbi Luciana question. She's also a doctoral candidate at JTS. She was your student, I guess, as well. And she's asking, can you tell us more about your motivation to read this micro story in this way? What does it say? What does it say about your relationship to the Talmud and your understanding of the place of Talmud in reimagining Judaism in the place of woman in it for our days?
Okay, that's a lot of questions. Let me try to remember. What motivated me to look at these stories? I think I've been working on this 5 or 6 years, by the way. I just finished writing the book about these stories, so maybe it'll come out in a year. What motivated me is that as I was reading through the Talmud for other purposes, not having anecdotes on my mind, I began noticing that there's a rule and then there's an anecdote, and they're not exactly the same. So in the beginning you say, oh, just happened here, just happened there. And then I began noticing it happen more often. So I actually developed a way of finding these anecdotes in the Talmud without having to turn page after page after page, because that would take a lot longer to find these anecdotes. Many of them, and we saw it here, some of them, let me see. The last anecdote we just looked at has the word ikla, visited, Ravina, ikla leve machoza. So I typed the word ikla, visit, into the database, and up popped something like 150 anecdotes. So I began looking at them and so on, and I found other terms like that. And what's really important to me is that, traditionally speaking, when people study Talmud, they don't jump from one anecdote to the next, to the next, to the next, which is what I'm doing now, but they study the page, what we call linear, line after line after line. When you study the Talmud in that traditional way of line after line, you come across an anecdote, today, and then a month from now, another anecdote, and 2 weeks later, another anecdote, and you don't think about it. You just say, oh, yeah, Rabbi carried out the halacha. Isn't that nice? There is a rule, and then the rabbi performs that rule. Okay, but if you study Talmud like that, you're never going to realize that there's more going on in the anecdote. It's not just a rabbi carrying out a law and looking like a pious religious rabbi. If you jump from one anecdote to the next, which is a technique that we've developed much more these days, databases help us, but even before databases, then you say, oh my God, there's something new to discover here that all these commentators over the ages didn't pay attention to, because this is not how they studied Talmud. And why is this of particular interest to me? Yes, of course, anytime you can say something new, that's exciting in and of itself. But it's of interest to me because as a rabbi of the conservative movement, and I speak now for Reform movement, I'm speaking now for all Jews, who I would call egalitarian Jews. Yes, it is okay to make changes. Today, can we allow women to count in a minyan? Yes, we can. On what basis am I saying that? Because this is very, very important to me. you could say, oh, for the sake of equality, we are going to treat women and men with the same privileges in Judaism. Well, I suppose you could come at it like that, but I'm much happier discovering that the Talmud itself is implicitly, okay, it's not exactly explicit, although we could argue about that. The Talmud itself is telling me that it's okay to make changes. And that gives me a firmer basis, a more convincing, persuasive basis for making changes today. Okay, I hope I've covered most of what you asked me.
Yes.
Something about women. Yes, I strongly believe in the equality of women under the law, and this kind of research allows me to arrive at that equality.
Thank you so much. Can I ask you something before we proceed with the next question, just to stop sharing the screen, because then you can see our face fully on the screen.
Sure.
That
Okay,
would be great.
I'm gonna stop share.
Yeah.
Okay.
Great, that's fantastic. Thank you so much. So
Okay.
there's a question from our audience here. To whom is more difficult to tell this story, to teach these stories, to men or women, or it doesn't matter?
If it's these 4 stories, it's easier to teach them to women than to men, because the first story in particular, because there you have women themselves who are not rabbis. That's clear. Women were not rabbis in the ancient world. They may have overheard discussion of halakha, but they were not active participants in the halakha process. There's no woman in the Talmud that becomes a rabbi. Yes, if it's these stories, it's easier to teach them to women. They're not all about women acting as legislators, but at least some of them are. But if we're talking about, if I didn't choose stories about women, if I just chose anecdotes in which a rabbi performs a halakha, and when he's doing it, he modifies it, then it would not make a difference. I will say, I have run this by Orthodox colleagues of mine, and that's difficult. That each time each story they look at, they say, oh no, it could be for this reason, it could be for that reason. So they're the ones who are resisting seeing what I believe is right there as a message of the Talmud.
There's a question here. Is there a limit for changes in halacha?
Yeah, that's a very good question too. All these questions are good. Yes, that's of course the question. And I'm going to say yes, all right, because first of all, if I say no, then tomorrow pork becomes kosher, all right? So I'm not headed towards pork becoming kosher. So number one, I'm going to say that there's got to be a good reason, all right? So if I look at these 4 anecdotes, I didn't anticipate your question with regard to these 4 anecdotes. Well, let me try to answer it. In the first one, the change is motivated by women wanting to make sure their husbands have their alcoholic drink before they go to bed. So there's the motivation. In the second one, the idea in the second one about on the Sabbath letting women hold cupfuls of barley for their husband, there I think there it's a little different. They're actually preserving the women's practice and letting that new stringency apply to a different grain, to wheat and not to barley. So there they impose their own limit actually. And in the third one, wait, did I skip something? Oh, I skipped the raking out the oven. Yeah, and raking out the oven, there was a motivation there. You're supposed to have really great meals, fresh, tasty bread, and again, without refrigeration. You bake bread every single day in the ancient world, Mediterranean world. There's a good motivation there. And in the final one, you know the motivation. The motivation is not to give back. Well, women are, this is good. Women are being described as generous, as charitable in that 4th anecdote. So I would say, of course, there are limits. If you're going to change the law, first of all, you need an ethical reason. And the obvious ethical reason in our day to making changes about women, about gay people, is that it was unethical to discriminate against women and against gay people. So that's like really easy for me to say, sure, there's a justification there, which come on now, could you really justify pork on any ethical basis? Well, if we were starving, but that's not the question. That, you know, is there a limit to halacha? So yes, am I going to allow you? I allow you is not exactly the right language. Would a rabbi permit somebody to violate the Sabbath? Let me think, by, I don't know, going to work on the Sabbath? If we're talking about ordinary circumstances, not that you're going to lose your job and starve to death if you don't work on the Sabbath, we're talking ordinary circumstances. No, of course I'm not going to allow you to work on the Sabbath. So it's going to be case by case. I'm sure philosophers of halakha could draw up a list. There's ethical reasons that justify changes in halakha. There are, the reasons that we talked about here, tasty bread and so on. But unless you have a good reason, which we could argue with you, you might think a good reason, I might think it not a good reason. That would be my answer. Surely there are limits. Otherwise, there'll be no Jewish observance left.
I have one more minute. So I have a question then. In terms of like halacha lemaseh, so women had would you say that women had a prominent role in actually changing men's mind in halacha lemaseh, in practical halacha in the Talmud, or is just like these are exceptions, like, and we nowadays elevate them so we can move forward with an ethical agenda that we believe in? Well,
beginning with the second part, sure, we when we want to make changes today, this is done not just by Reform Jews, not just by conservative, also by Orthodox Jews. I believe Orthodox Jews have strayed from the path, but I'm just saying, sure, we look for a precedent in the Talmud, and it could be a minority opinion, it could be one of these tiny anecdotes that's we don't see very much of it, sure, and we choose our texts very carefully, and we can make them the basis of whatever rule it is that we're interested in promoting. And then you argue with the colleagues. I sit on the CJLS, Committee for Jewish Law and Standards. It's the halacha committee of the conservative movement, and you won't believe the debates that go on in that. Now, talk about COVID-19. I'm not ashamed to admit that I went on Zoom on Yom Kippur, on Rosh Hashanah also, but I'll talk more about Yom Kippur. For Kol Nidre, I did a Zoom service for people that have been coming to me for years in the synagogue, in a space, for a Kol Nidre service, because I decided, forget the Talmud, forget and so on. I said to myself, their needs to have a Kol Nidre service are more important than my need not to open my computer on Yom Kippur. I don't open my computer on Yom Kippur. I never have. And this year I did, because that's how I made that decision. I don't know if we can call that halachic decision or not. That was more what I felt I had to do. But I'm just giving an example. COVID has sent in to the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards of the conservative movement many, many questions of this sort. Can we, a minyan, can we have 10 people form minyan if they're not all in the same place? Because certainly in the more serious part of the lockdown in New York City, we couldn't have 10 people, even social distancing in the synagogues. Synagogues were closed. I don't know exactly the details of what's happening in Brazil right now. So yes, what was the beginning of your question? I have a feeling I answered the second part.
No, but I think that was great. I'll end with it because I think this was just perfect. Thank you so much, Professor Hauptman. And for me personally, it was a delight to study with you again after so many years. Not so much, but not so many years ago, but Yes. And
I'm thrilled when people from my past contact me. As I was telling Rabbi Mayara before, I'm stuck in my home in COVID-19, and to be able to go on Zoom and reach people and teach people is thrilling for me. This is what I've always loved to do, and I don't have to walk out my door to do it. So I'm delighted that I was invited.
So you're invited again for the next one. I just want to already make the next invitation publicly. You're already invited for the next one. So
okay.
Thank you so much.